I'm not here to question the intelligence, the courage, or the commitment of a fine general and a fine career diplomat. But I think we should examine carefully what they said, what they didn't say, and what it means for the future. Both men stressed the improvement in security that the surge had brought to certain areas. But they said that the war will only end with a political arrangement between the warring factions. Everyone here agrees with that, including Senator Graham. And then they conceded that there has been virtually no progress towards the underlying goal of the surge. This is, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, a devastating admission of failure for the original rationale of the surge as presented by President Bush on January 10th of this year, although it was presented to this distinguished committee in a way that obscured the fact that they were admitting that the reason for sending the troops had not been achieved. I will move in a minute to the issue of the Sunnis in the West because that's a critical aspect of this. So let's take a closer look at what the two men said. It makes the situation even more troubling to me personally. Current administration policy is at odds with itself. The policies currently being pursued are strengthening the regions, but the administration continues to say that their goal is a strong and effective central government. In fact, the administration is in an untenable long-term position. They are simultaneously supporting the Sunnis in the West, the Kurds in the North, and the Shiite government of Prime Minister Maliki. That is not a government of Iraq. That is not even a government of the Shiites. That is a faction of a faction in limited control of very limited areas of the country, mainly the Green Zone. Meanwhile, Iran has replaced the British as they withdraw as the dominant force in the south, and that includes a large portion of Iraq's non-Kurdish oil. Reports suggest they are siphoning off illegally perhaps 250,000 barrels a day. That would be more than 10% of Iraq's capacity to produce at full levels, illegally in the Gulf of Basra. Not hard to do. The Iranians, of course, are the long-term beneficiary of what has happened in Iraq since the invasion. So let's look first, Mr. Chairman, at the much-heralded improvement in the situation in Anbar province, which Senator Lindsay so eloquently and I think accurately described. General Petraeus was entirely correct when he agreed to the request by the Sunni tribes for assistance when they changed sides and came to the United States for weapons and money. But these short-term gains, which General Petraeus stressed and which Senator Graham stressed, are not on behalf of that central government that we're allegedly trying to strengthen. They are exactly the opposite. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, of course, a famous Arab saying. But for how long? The Sunni tribes we're now assisting are the same people who were fighting us and killing Americans until very recently. They know full well that when we overthrew Saddam Hussein, we ended 400 years of Sunni rule in Baghdad, going back to the Ottomans, the British, and Saddam. They'll never forget that. They hate the Shia leaders in Baghdad. They understand that eventually the United States will leave the region, and they will have to look to Saudi Arabia for the money and support to keep them autonomous from control of Baghdad and against the Iranians who are going to be increasingly in evidence in supporting those Shiites. After the Sunni tribes defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq, which I'm sure they will do, because it's their territory and AQI is an interloper, then the Sunnis will turn again against the Shiites in Baghdad, their ancient rivals, and they will also run their own affairs in Anbar in the West with little or no regard for Baghdad's views. Except, of course, they'll ask for their share of the oil revenue, which the Shiites won't want to give them. And meanwhile, I'll get to the oil in a minute, Mr. Chairman. The story of the Kurdish North is well known. Many of you in this room have been there. I was there a few months ago. We all know that the Kurds are independent in all but name. Their own flag, their own money, their own language, the tightest internal border security, the tightest border security in all of Iraq is to go from Baghdad to Erbil, not to get into the country. That is 6 layers of security checkpoints. They test you. I don't know how many of you have ever driven through those checkpoints, but they stop the cars. They ask you in Kurdish who you are. If you don't speak Kurdish, they inspect your car. They say where you're going. Give us a phone number. They call those people, and if the people in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, don't know who you are, they won't let you in. That's why Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, is the most peaceful part of the country, and I might stress the most pro-American. But it is also explosive. War could break out at any time between Turkey and the Iraqi Kurds, and the threat from the PKK terrorist groups on the Turkish and Iranian borders could easily push our indispensable Turkish allies closer to the Iranians. There has been too much covert military discussion already between the Turkish General Staff in Ankara and the Iranians. And I stress again, as I've said before your committee before, Mr. Chairman, that Turkey is the frontline state of America's foreign policy in the post-Cold War era. Turkey is to the U.S. today what the Berlin Wall and Checkpoint Charlie were in the Cold War. We cannot afford to use a phrase freighted with misunderstandings. We cannot afford to lose Turkey. The equilibrium in the Kurdish north is not stable. What then of the most difficult area of Iraq, the south, where the Shiites are warring against each other and Iran is quickly asserting itself? No aspect of the Iraqi puzzle will give the U.S. greater problems, because any solution to the problems of this area will necessarily require Iranian participation. Given the nature of that regime in Tehran and its other activities against American interests, support of Hamas and Hezbollah, the supplying of high-tech explosives to insurgents who are killing Americans in Iraq, its defiant drive to become a nuclear power, and its virulently anti-Semitic positions, any dealings with Iran would be both politically sensitive here at home and extremely difficult to conduct. But it will be impossible to deal with Iran's long-term challenge to America's interests as long as we're enmeshed in Iraq. You cannot do the Iran project, whatever it is, whether you favor a military strike or diplomacy, whatever it is, you can't get there while they can turn on and off the spigot in Iraq at will and for their own purposes. But there is a precedent for limited Iranian-American cooperation, the 2001 negotiations in Germany that set up the Karzai government. Why did Iran and the United States cooperate? Because we had a common interest, getting rid of the Taliban and creating a stable Afghanistan. It remains to be seen, Mr. Chairman, whether the same is true in Iraq. Many Iranian experts I talked to in preparation for this testimony today believe that while Tehran intends to be the dominant player in eastern Iraq and southern Iraq, they don't want complete chaos or a protracted proxy war with Saudi Arabia. And that might follow an American withdrawal. If these untested assumptions were correct, there might be room for a serious discussion with Tehran, and one that could encompass other issues. But the handful of meetings that are publicly known to have taken place between Iranian officials and American officials in Baghdad are neither serious nor sufficiently high level. Ironically, this messy, internally contradictory situation could offer the United States one last chance for a political arrangement that would avert full-scale civil war. And that, Mr. Chairman, in my view, and I stress that I used the word might just now, it might be to avert a full-scale civil war would be to create a power-sharing federal structure that gives more authorities to the regions while keeping Iraq a single country within its current international boundaries. After all, Mr. Chairman, that is what the facts on the ground are in fact producing. facts that the administration is encouraging by supporting the Sunni uprising and by helping keep Kurdistan autonomous. That does not apply in the South, where the U.S. has no influence. You'll notice that General Petraeus was in London yesterday, according to the newspapers, and I'm sure this is true given the nature of the trip. He was there asking the British to stay engaged, but that isn't going to happen. This approach would require the sort of creative, out-of-the-box thinking that Washington policymakers are always calling for and then always resisting. Washington would have to test the proposition that in Iraq controlled by a strong central government, which is what we're still calling for and what Senator Graham was advocating, indeed predicting, Washington would have to test the proposition that in Iraq controlled by a strong central government is not only no longer possible, unless it's under a brutal regime like Saddam's, but it is not even a desirable objective, since it inevitably would contain the seeds of constant uprisings against it by one or another of the regions. Almost 4 years ago, Les Gelb proposed in the New York Times a version of this approach based loosely on the Dayton peace agreements that ended the war in Bosnia in 1995, a tripartite federal power-sharing arrangement. Other people have endorsed it as time went along. I supported it from the beginning and indeed worked with Les on his original article, but did not co-sign it for various reasons. Even Henry Kissinger advocated something along these lines in his Washington Post column last Sunday. But these ideas were rejected by the Baker-Hamilton Commission and by the Bush administration, perhaps on the basis of confusion between a federal system and full partition of the country into 3 countries, which is not what Les Gelb or Henry Kissinger advocated. A footnote for the record is that Peter Galbraith does advocate that. I have great respect for Peter. He worked for me in Croatia, and that you have every reason to want to hear from Peter too, but let us be clear that these are 2 different proposals. And to talk about Gelb-Biden on one hand, Gelb-Biden-Galbraith is to mix up different proposals. What Les Gelb is talking about, what Kissinger seems to be endorsing, is a loose federal structure. That's the reason the United States exists. We're a federal system. It could never have been a unitary state. A loose federal system is probably the only way to keep Iraq a single country and avoid almost continuous war and avoid Iraq becoming a kind of a Somalia, which is where it's headed now. That a regionalized Iraq already exists is obvious for the most part on the ground, yet the administration continues to resist, encouraging that it be formalized in a way that allows people to stop killing each other and fighting a central government. Let us be clear in conclusion, Mr. Chairman. The high water mark of American involvement in Iraq has already passed, whether people realize it or not. It is not conceivable, at least not to me, that any administration will send more troops to Iraq in the future. The administration is reducing the troops, and it should not miss its last window to try to negotiate something before, with the departure of the last surge troops next year, it loses its remaining leverage. President Bush has said, what we've all known for a long time, that he will pass this war and Afghanistan, 2 wars, on to his successor. But he still has a chance to pass on something better than the mess he has so far created. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.